In this video, we'll be designing 3 road blocks, which will then be used to procedurally generate a road. This video is targeted towards the users who have never used Blender before and want a better understanding of modeling an asset, adding materials to it, adding custom collisions to it, as well as exporting that to the Unreal Engine framework. For the exporting part of this video, we will be using this useful documentation page that Unreal has provided that tells us how to best model our meshes. For example, in this picture right here, we see that the model should be modeled using triangular shapes instead of squares. So with that being said, let's start a new project and start modeling our roads. So now that we have Blender open, I'd like to bring your attention to this 3 mouse buttons here. This effectively just shows the keystrokes that I'm doing throughout the video. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this section here and I'm going to join the area. And I'm going to join the area just so that we have more room to model. Now from here, the basic transformations you can use in Blender is hitting G, and now you can see that the mesh is movable. So G, then X, it restricts the movement to just being the X-axis. If I were to hit Y, it restricts the movement to just being in the Y-axis. If I were to hit Z, you'll see the movement just moving in the Z-axis. So if I hit N, we'll notice there's a drop down, and in the item section, we'll notice the transformation of our cube. So to add a cube, all you need to do is Shift and then A. In the mesh section, you can add a cube. There you go. This essentially created a cube and overlaid it on top of the old cube. So let's get rid of that cube. Click on it and then hit delete. So now I'm going to change the dimensions of our cube. I'm going to keep it 6 by 6 and keep the height 1. Sorry. Now with our dimensions 6 by 6 by 1, what we can do is we can define the topology of this mesh by clicking on our mesh and then hitting tab. The tab section just shows the topology of this mesh. So if you were to hit 1, what it will highlight is the vertices of that mesh. If you were to hit 2, it will highlight the edges of that mesh. So these 2 edges. If you were to click 3, you can select the faces of that mesh. So to first start off, I'm going to select this face and I'm going to hit Control R. I can add a line just to segment this mesh. And I'm creating this line such that I can add the curves of our road. So I'm going to do 0.85. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to click on the face. So go on face mode, click on that, Control R, and go to a point where it can add the mesh. And then drag that to be around negative 0.85. We want to keep things as symmetric as possible. So notice the shape here is 8.5, so then that would mean this has to be negative 0.85. So with that, we can then click on the face, click on these faces. So we're going to hit 3, so shift left click to select both faces. We're going to hit E for extrude, and then we're going to constrain that to the Z-axis. So now that it's constrained to the Z-axis, we can go up and it extrudes our curves. We can also define how much it gets extruded by this section in here. So 1.5 or maybe around 2 would be better. So now that we added the curves to our mesh, we're going to add the slashes that the roads have in the middle section. So to do that, we're going to do Control R to add a new segment. And then we're going to keep this fairly symmetric. So I'm going to click N to show the segment. And I want to keep the segment around 0.01 or negative 0.1. There we go. So we have that. And then I'm going to add another segment, so I'm going to click on the face. I'm going to add another segment to have that here. And I'm going to say this is going to be 0.1. From there, hit 3 for faces. So now with the faces selected, I can do Control R, and from here I can add an edge, and then you'll notice at the bottom left there's a loop cut. So I'm gonna drag that. I'm gonna define this -0.6, and from there I can define the number of cuts that this has. So if I were to do maybe around 8 or 9, there we go. So this creates the faces for our mesh. Now we can add the materials for our mesh. So if we go into the shading section, we have the default material that it's being assigned is white. So we can say the white is the curb color. So if I were to hit tab on the shape, we'll notice the topology that we had selected before is still there. So what I can do from here is I can define the parts of the road that should be black and that should be white. To do so, we'll notice in this materials panel, you'll notice that right now the only asset is curb color. So you'll notice in the materials panel, there is this plus button in here. So if I were to click on that, what it essentially does is it creates a new material, and that pops up a new slot in here. So these two, the shader graph and this material panel in here, are essentially the same thing. So if I were to say new material, and then I can click on black for the roads. Then from here I have my material, and then I can name this road color. Now that I have my road color, I can click on the faces that I want to have this material. Since I'm in edit mode, I can hit 3 to select the faces, and then I can just click on the faces that should have the color black in them. So I have all these faces that should have the color black, and I'm able to select them by just hitting shift and then left clicking on each one. And what I'll do is I'll have this portion be white. So everything selected will essentially be my black color. So now that you have everything selected, you can hit road color, and then you can hit assign, and you'll notice now it has the black road color. What we can do from here is go back to the modeling tab. Circle shows the model. This third panel will show the shading of our model. So we have our shading. What we can do is hit Shift D to duplicate, and then constrain the movement to be the x-axis. So we have our new material. And one thing you'll notice is if I were to hit numpad and then hit 0, it will zoom into that shape. One thing I can do in here is select 3 faces. So let's select these faces. And what I can do is hit E to extrude, and then Z, so the global Z, and then extrude it up by 2. So now that you have your shape extruded, what you can do is go back to the shading tab, and in here you can hit tab and select the faces that you want that specific shaded part to be a part of. So we have these 3 faces that we want to change color to white. So we have these 3, there we go, and then that, and then we're gonna hit the curve material and then assign the curve material to that. So now that we have that, this is essentially our start mesh. And then now going back to the modeling section, we can, from here, we can just do Shift D and then do Y to duplicate that. And from here, now that we've duplicated it, the end mesh will just be the rotation of the beginning mesh. So I can click on the end mesh and then go to the rotation, and we're rotating it in the Z. So that would be 180 in the Z. So now it's rotated. Now that we have our 3 roadblocks, we're going to prepare these meshes so that it can be exported properly into our engine. And to do this, we're going to need to change the way that the edges are set up such that they're not squares but rather triangles. So if I were to go in edit mode, and I can do that by hitting tab and then hit 3 for the faces, and then just select all the faces by hitting A. If you want to deselect all the faces, you can hit Alt A. So Alt is the undo of the command that you write. So if you hit A, and then from here, what you can do is hit Control T. And this will essentially triangulate all the edges that you have in your mesh. We can do the same thing for here as well. So A, then Control T, as well as this one. So go to edit mode by hitting tab, while selecting the mesh you want, hitting A, and Control T. Okay, so now that we have all our triangular meshes, to make it easier for the hardware to render in the game, what we can take a look at is adding simple collisions to it. Now, depending on your use case, if this were a simple prop or a generated road that isn't too crazy with how it's designed, as in there aren't a lot of upward hills or downward hills, then you'd probably want to keep the collision simple. The way we're able to keep the collision simple, Shift A to bring up this pop-up bar, and then from here, clicking a cube, for example, and we're essentially trying to cover the same shapes that this road has. So instead of using this, instead of using the middle road, I'll actually use this side road, just because it has more shapes to it. So I bring this here, and then just center everything. So to the transform, just center everything by hitting 0, 0, 0. Okay, so from here, I can scale this cube that I just created. So I can do S, then scale in the Y to make it thinner, scale in the Y to make it thinner, and I'm gonna grab it, and then, so G, and then move it in the Y direction. So we have it here, and then I'm gonna need to scale it in the X to make it wider. So just, now that we have the shape, we're gonna drag it, so G, then Z. And this shape is roughly how our road looks like. We're doing this so that the road itself has its simpler collisions to better render, because otherwise what the alternative is it will either like put a too general shape, as in put a box around this mesh, or it will use these triangular shapes to add the collisions. So if I were to scale this in the Y direction, and there we go, just roughly cover that shape, and then move it to the Y, and scale it a bit in the Z, there we go, and then scale it a bit in the Y, perfect. So now all I have to do is do Shift D, and then constrain its movement to the Y by hitting Y, and then having that here. And essentially we can do the same for that end piece. So now we can rotate it by 90 degrees, and we'll scale it a bit in the Y, and now grab it in the X, push it back, numpad 0 to zoom into that object, then grab in the X to roughly cover that shape. It's a bit hard to see with the coloring. Scale the X. There we go. So that roughly covers that shape. And then from there, we just need our last shape. So all we would need to do is cover this base. Do Shift D, and then move to the X, and scale it in the X, so it's like that, and then grab and then constrain its movement to just the Z. So you'll notice that this shape, scale roughly, make it thinner. So you'll notice that this shape roughly covers the shape of our static mesh. So these would be simple collisions you would want in if this was being used as a prop or something. So the thing that makes the engine treat it as a collision and not just another static mesh is the naming convention. So if you're trying to get the engine to treat it as a collision, you're going to have to prefix it with a UCX followed by the name of your static mesh. So in this case, I'm aiming to name the static mesh the start road. So start and then road. Or I'll use the Unreal naming convention. So UCX underscore SM start road. So now that I have that, I'll do that for the other two. And since there are multiple objects in here, I'm going to use the descending order collision naming convention. So I'm going to copy this name and then just have it renamed O2. What specific mesh gets named O2 and O1 doesn't necessarily matter. It's just the only thing that does matter is just them having different numbers. So from here, we have the four collisions of our static mesh. We're going to name our static mesh, since in here I called it SM underscore start road. That has to match the name of our static mesh. And so this name should be called SM underscore start road. Start road. And then from here, it's the same thing with these other two. So I'm going to skip that step and just create the static meshes. So start road or straight road. And I'm going to call this SM underscore end road. So now that we have our three, I'll just get rid of the lighting and the camera since they're not needed. So now with the three static meshes that we just created, we're going to be exporting these to the Unreal Engine framework. To export the start road with its collisions, we're going to select the start road and control and click on its collisions, which are labeled with a UCX. And then from there, we're going to go to File and export FBX. And from here, I'm going to do selected objects to ensure that the selected objects are going to be exported. I'm going to click on mesh just to make sure that's selected, and our forward will be X forward and our up will be Z up. And then from here, I'm just going to name it SM underscore start road and export that. And then I'm going to do the same for the straight road and the end road. File, export, FBX, and then I'm going to call it straight road. And likewise for the end road. So now that I've exported the FBX files, I'm going to make a folder called assets. I'm going to call this folder level assets. So from there, I'm just going to drag my three FBX files into the Unreal Engine editor. And then by doing so, you'll get this pop-up. And we're just going to do import. And then import and import. And typically it has these unresolved errors, but it resolves them and just tells you like there were warnings to begin with. So from there, we have our roads, and then we have the two materials that have been used for our roads. So if we click on the SM straight road, for example, we'll notice that this is our straight road with the materials we have assigned to it. In this case, the road color, there we go. It just took some time to assign the material. But now we see our models exported to Unreal Engine. One thing I would like to show is with the start road, you'll notice that if I were to do collision, simple collision, we'll notice that the collisions are fitting the shape of our road. This is because we made its custom collisions in Blender. But if we were to look at something that hasn't been made with the custom collisions, for example, the end road, we'll notice that its collisions, if I were to do simple, it's just going to generate its own simple collision, and it will just be a box. So this wouldn't be that helpful if we were to design this for our road. Now, if we go into our complex collision, these types of collisions are what we use to model our mesh itself. And what it's doing by having this, it's treating each vertices for the mesh as its own collision box. So we have two options. We can use the simple collisions or we can use the complex ones. The complex ones comes with the caveat that it takes longer to run in the engine in comparison to using custom simple collisions made in Blender. But this is something you're going to have to experiment with as you design your level and determine how accurately you want your collisions to wrap around your mesh. Since we're using a procedural road, that means there's going to be a lot of curves and uphills and downhills, which means we will need more complex collisions to form within our mesh. So if I were to click use complex collisions as simple, we'll notice that it will treat the collisions of our assets as the complex ones that were created for the mesh. And we can do that for all of them. And just to make things a little cleaner, I'm going to choose to create a new folder and call this materials, just to put all of my materials in one folder. So I'm going to click on these two and drag them to materials. There we go. So if you enjoyed this video, please hit like, and a new video is going to be coming up soon about creating generated roads through these three meshes. So be on the lookout for that. All right, bye. To export the mesh,